On Veir-Silence station, air costs more than fuel, and a stray sound could be more expensive than a fine for a botched docking. Sam realized this while still in the cargo corridor, pushing his container toward the checkpoint and watching the market move around him. Hundreds of beings passed by, exchanging access bracelets, cylinders, capsules, and dry signs on recorders, but almost no one spoke. In other ports, noise was a part of life. The cursing of stevedores, the crackle of announcements, the laughter of pilots, arguments over the queue to the airlock. Here, everything happened so quietly that even the container's wheels felt like a breach of the peace. Sam wasn't superstitious, but in this silence, he felt not discipline, but a long-standing habit of fearing one's own voice. The container moved heavily, though its weight shouldn't have caused any issues. Dry soil shifted inside, and every shove sent a soft wave echoing into his lower back. In the documents, the cargo was listed as mineral substrate from an Earth greenhouse, Kansas region. Just soil, if you believed the manifest. Sam had seen more dangerous cargo: acid blocks, reactor cores, medical capsules with markings that were better left unread. But for this dirt, they had paid double the rate. The sender had requested not to use the station manipulators, and, before departure, uttered a strange phrase. On Veir-Silence, it's not just what you say that matters, but how you sound. At the time, Sam dismissed it as local mysticism, convenient for those who wanted to seem more important than their cargo. He had long lived by a simple rule: don't ask questions if they're paying for delivery, and not for curiosity. This rule hadn't appeared overnight. Many years ago, his mechanic Merrick found an anomaly in the paperwork of a container and asked to delay the loading. Sam refused back then. The flight was urgent, the client was pushing, fines were mounting, and the young mechanic seemed too principled for dirty work. A few hours later, Merrick was carried out of the reactor compartment, and for the first time, Sam understood that silence also leaves a signature. Since then, he had become more careful with fastenings, locks, and temperature tolerances, but he still kept his questions to himself. Questions delayed flights, and delays killed a business faster than a conscience. There were 37 meters left to the checkpoint. Sam always counted distances in foreign ports, to the exit, to the guards, to the emergency airlock, to the spot where he could ditch the cargo and leave on foot if things went completely sideways. Here, ditching wasn't an option. The corridor was narrowing. A dense crowd stood on both sides, and breathing tanks hummed on the backs, necks, and sides of alien bodies. Some bought air from the station line, some carried their own supply, some rationed it so carefully that their chest membranes barely moved. This market traded in everything, but the primary commodity remained the inhale. The checkpoint zone began without a wall. The gray floor transitioned into orange light, and the light itself felt like a warning. Sam pushed the container across the boundary and immediately felt the air grow thicker. Not an accident, not a pressure drop, just an unpleasant heaviness in his throat, as if the station had paused for a second to listen to him. Two inspectors stood by the passage. Tall, slender, with flexible limbs and throat plates, they didn't move until Sam approached within a distance where it was already difficult to turn around without a collision. Quote, 1, he said, holding out a chip bracelet. Quote, 2. The first inspector did not take the bracelet. The second stepped slightly away from the container, and Sam noticed that step immediately. Officials usually reach for documents, argue, demand extra fees, or pretend they are resolving the matter. This one did not haggle or object. He was clearing space for himself. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 3, underscore, underscore, the first inspector said. The voice came through a recorder at the throat plate, dry and delayed by a fraction of a second. Quote, 4, quote, 5, Sam said. Quote, 6. The container suddenly stopped. The wheels were free, but the lower frame was gripped by a barely visible field. Sam tried to push harder, then stopped himself. A fixation field is activated not for inspection, but so that the person being inspected understands their position. The inspector touched the lock. Sam said sharply. The click sounded quiet, but in this corridor, it was heard by everyone who wanted not to hear. The lid rose a few centimeters and the scent of soil escaped. To Sam, it was just common damp dust, slightly sweet, with remnants of roots. But the inspectors reacted, as if it wasn't a scent rising from the container, but a name that is forbidden to be spoken. The second one pressed his limbs to his torso. The first froze, and his recorder flashed green. then orange. The crowd around them didn't turn, didn't murmur, didn't draw closer. On the contrary, the space around Sam grew a bit emptier. Everyone stepped back just enough to avoid being a participant. Quote 9, quote, Sam said, quote, 10, quote, 11, quote, 12, quote, the vocoder replied, quote, 13, quote. Sam stared at the inspector for a few seconds, trying to understand which part of the sentence was an error. Category 1 meant isolation, fines, route blocking, and long disputes with those who never return a deposit. The recorder flashed again. Now Sam saw that the device was reacting to more than just words. It was catching pauses, volume, breathing rhythm, perhaps even the tension in his voice. Sam said, his voice lower now. Sam gripped his tablet. In any other port, he would have demanded a supervisor, a protocol, compensation, a reinspection, and somewhere between the legal words, there would be room for a sum that both parties would call an expedited fee. But here, an argument turned into evidence before he could even choose a point. The station was not listening to the meaning, it was listening to the form. Quote 22, he said. Quote 23, quote 24, quote 25, quote 26. The floor beneath his feet shuddered. A low guide rail rose behind him. At his sides, the air grew thick, as if an invisible wall had pressed against his palm. No one grabbed Sam. No one raised a weapon. The system simply decided where he should go, and left his body with the duty of following the route. A belt activated beneath the floor, gently pushing him toward a side passage. The container followed, open, fixed, and already foreign to his hands. The holding cell turned out to be lower than a human body required. It wasn't cramped in terms of floor space, but the ceiling pressed down on his shoulders, forcing him to tuck his neck in, and the ledge by the wall was positioned in such a way that he had to sit with his knees almost touching his chest. Sam lowered himself onto it, hit his shoulder blade against a panel, and cursed silently. The container had been placed by the door, its lid left open. The soil inside lay still, and that was more irritating than any threat. It did nothing, yet it had already ruined the run. He opened the documents again. The sender was hidden behind a temporary contract. The recipient was Sector 17, a factional clearance with no name, and several technical fields wouldn't translate in the human interface. A typical murky manifest for gray cargo. Before, Sam would have stopped there. Now, his eyes caught the line, "Sent tag confirmed." He had seen it before departure, but the tablet had flagged the field as secondary. A scent tag for a shipment of dirt hadn't seemed more important than humidity or packing density. Hunger arrived after the anger. Sam pulled a protein bar from his pocket, broke off a piece, and froze as the sensors along the walls flared red. A line appeared on the panel by the door. Quote, 28. He looked at the bar, then at the panel. The panel blinked. Sam gave a short laugh at the absurdity of it, and the red light grew brighter. The laughter cut off on its own. He raised his free hand as if the walls could be calmed with a gesture. Quote, 31. The red shifted to orange, but it didn't go out. Sam rested the bar on his knee, and for the first time clearly felt that the local law didn't just forbid actions, it attempted to assign them meaning. Food, voice, laughter, scent, everything passed through some invisible grammar of the station, where an ordinary human gesture could become a violation. The door opened a narrow crack. First, a tank entered the holding cell, then a body wrapped in tubes. The creature moved cautiously, conserving both space and air. The tank on its back hummed low with a steady rhythm, and Sam realized this alien was paying for every minute spent inside. Quote, 32, the newcomer said. The voice came from the tank's membrane, as if the words were assembled from pressure. Sam slowly lowered the bar. I hope that's not an accusation for you people. The creature made a sound like a failing valve, possibly laughter. The sensors only blinked orange. My great-grandfather broke the silence when he fed those who were forbidden to speak. He too was considered an environmental pollutant. Sam looked at the container. The newcomer was looking there as well, not at the documents or the lock, but at the soil. Name your price, Sam said, for an explanation, for a way out of here, for making it so my cargo is no longer Category 1. The alien remained silent for a long time. His limb touched the side of the container, then slowly lowered into the soil. At the first touch, he recoiled, but not from pain. It was the way a person pulls their hand back from something they didn't expect to recognize. Quote, 38. Quote, he said. Quote, 39. Quote, 40. Quote, 41. Quote. Sam didn't like answers like that, but Envis's tone blunted the ready rudeness. There was no desire to appear mysterious in him. Rather, the caution of one who speaks near someone else's dead. Then why are you here? Envis leaned toward the soil. The tank hummed more quietly, and it seemed to Sam that the old man held his breath for a second, though he wasn't sure if that word applied to his body. Underscore, quote, underscore 43, underscore. Sam wanted to answer habitually. Region of origin, composition, greenhouse, mineral substrate. But all those words suddenly became useless. Envis wasn't asking about the cargo. I didn't know, Sam said. Here, ignorance also becomes a record. Does everything here become a record? Everything that can be used. Everything that can be sold. Everything that can be turned against the person who made an extra sound. Sam looked at the sensors, at the panel, at the exposed soil. The station no longer seemed like a strange bureaucracy to him. It was a mechanism that turns a reaction into a law. What is in this soil? Envis remained silent for a long time, consuming air on the pause. Traces of those who were left with nothing but a scent. They learned to ask without words. Who are they? The door behind Envis began to close. His paid time was running out. He didn't try to hold the leaf of the door. Quote, 52, he said. Quote, 53, the door shut. Sam remained in the low holding cell, next to the container that just this morning had seemed like the simplest cargo of the month. He picked up the tablet again, found the line about the recipient, and reread it slowly. Factional clearance, without a name. Scent tag confirmed. Mineral substrate. Now these words looked not like a cargo description, but like a disguise for a plea that he had agreed to transport because he was paid for silence. Sam put the bar back into his pocket and stared at the soil for a long time, trying to understand how many times in his life he had called someone else's misfortune an invoice, just so he wouldn't have to linger at the door. Sam sat in the cell for several minutes without moving. The orange light along the walls no longer pulsed, but it didn't fade either, as if the station were waiting for his next violation. He could open a complaint form, demand a senior inspector, try to hail his ship, or send an encrypted message to the client. All these actions were familiar, understandable, and correct for a captain who wants to pull a voyage out of a penalty pit. But after Envis's words, each of them felt like an appeal to the very same system that had already decided that his voice, food, and laughter were material for an indictment. He pulled a folding pot from his side pocket, not as a solution, but out of an old habit. On cargo ships after accidents, someone always heated water, for themselves, for the mechanics, for those sitting on the floor pretending that their hands were shaking from the cold. Sam poured a little water from his flask, turned on the heat, and watched as a thin stream of steam rose to the low ceiling, spread across the metal, and dripped back down. The sensors on the walls flashed a brighter orange, but the red light didn't trigger. Then he opened a packet of dried meat and dropped a few strips into the water. The smell of salt, fat, and human food sharply entered the sterile air of the cell. Something clicked behind the door. Sam took a spoon and slowly stirred the water. Metal struck metal briefly, almost comically, but in this silence, the sound came out defiant. He looked at the sensor and said wearily, "Record it. You're recording the pauses anyway." The door opened faster than the first time. Envis squeezed inside. The tank on his back brushed the edge of the opening and hissed briefly. The old merchant didn't look at Sam. All his attention was on the pot, on the steam, on the spoon that left a simple, coarse human melody in the air. Envis said. For the first time that day, Sam smiled without bitterness. Envis's tank emitted a stuttering sound, like the cough of an old valve. Only now did Sam realize. It was laughter. It wasn't free or light. It was as if it had been pulled from a depth where it had been held for a long time without the right to escape. The sensors flickered, hesitant to change color, and Sam saw in this the first small crack. The system knew perfectly well how to record threats, deals, pleas, and violations, but a human dinner in a holding cell left it at a loss. Envis moved closer to the pot. His limb touched the steam and immediately jerked back. A second later, he repeated the gesture more cautiously, just as he had touched the soil. It wasn't an inspection or an analysis. It was recognition. "Quote 60, he said. Quote 61. Sam stopped stirring. Quote 62. Envis turned toward the container. The soil lay by the door as an open dark mass, and the steam from the pot mingled with its scent until the cell began to feel less like an isolation unit and more like the cramped compartment of an old ship after a rain that had never actually happened here. Envis said. Sam listened in silence. It was like dozens of port stories he had heard before. Only here, everything had been brought to perfection. You don't need to beat people if you can make their inhalation paid for. You don't need to ban memory if you can declare it a biological risk. Quote 68. Quote, he said. Quote 69. Quote, quote 70. Quote, quote 71. Quote, quote 72. Quote. Envis touched the edge of the container and slowly turned it toward Sam. Under a layer of soil, almost at the very bottom, a thin mark had been burned. 3 lines converged at a point, while a 4th broke off nearby, as if erased before completion. Sam leaned closer. The mark didn't look fresh. It had been made before loading, perhaps even before the container had reached the sender. Is this the sector's sign? An old sign, before the numbers, before the tanks, before their right to a voice was considered a threat. Soil carries the scent of the place their ancestors called home. Scent requires no words, which means it is harder to judge as speech. Sam ran his finger along the inner wall of the container. Until this moment, he had still clung to the thought that he had stumbled into someone else's conflict by accident. Now, the accident looked far too convenient. He had been chosen precisely because he didn't ask questions. A man with a ship, a clean license, and a habit of keeping quiet. The perfect carrier for a plea that cannot be spoken. They wanted the cargo to reach Envis? He asked. Not me. Through me. I trade air near Sector 17. Sometimes those who have no right to speak still find those who remember sense. Sam gave a short, humorless chuckle. So, I'm a courier for a dead language. For the living, who have been made to look like the dead. That sentence settled between them more heavily than he would have liked. Sam remembered Merrick again. Not his face, nor his voice, but the thermal blanket under which the body seemed smaller than it had been in life. Back then, plenty of the right words were found too. Mounting failure, thermal regime violation, labeling discrepancy. No one wrote. The captain didn't want to stop. What do they want? Sam asked. The right to declare themselves in the trade. The right to air without intermediaries. The right to speak one's name so that the recorder doesn't turn it into a violation. And the soil will provide that? The soil itself? No. But it forced the system to recognize the address. Now it needs to understand who has the right to answer. Sam looked at the pot. And what does my food have to do with it? Envis didn't answer immediately. He extended a limb toward the steam, held it there, then moved it toward the spoon. Quote, 88. Quote, 89. Quote, 90. Sam slowly picked up the pot and held it out to Envis. Not solemnly, without any grand gesture. Just the way one passes something hot to someone standing nearby. Envis froze. The tank on his back hummed more steadily, but Sam could see the tension in every folded limb. Perhaps among his people, one didn't take food from a stranger's hands. Perhaps such a gesture held a dozen legal meanings. Perhaps he was simply afraid the station would finally find a precise charge for this. But after a few seconds, the old merchant's limb settled on the rim of the pot. The sensors flashed green. Only for a moment. Then they turned orange again. What was that? Sam asked. An action recording. I was silent. Here, even actions are silent, if one knows how to read them. Sam felt a chill beneath his skin. He began to understand why the sender had warned him about the sound. Veir-Silence didn't just listen to voices. It gathered meaning from everything. Intonations, pauses, scents, gestures, the passing of food. And if somewhere in the old protocols a similar pattern existed, an ordinary human act could become a legal fact. Envis set the pot back down. Quote 95, quote 96, quote 97, quote 98. The floor of the cell shuddered. The orange light above the door turned yellow. The container closed on its own, but the latch left a thin gap through which the scent of soil continued to linger in the cell. Sam shoved the tablet into his pocket, took the pot, and stood up, bumping his shoulder against the low ceiling. Quote 99, quote 100, quote 101. The door opened. Beyond it lay the market, dense and silent, full of tanks, recorders, and beings who already knew that the dispute would not be about soil. Sam was led onto the trading platform, not as the accused or a witness, more like a piece of the cargo. The floor beneath his feet moved almost imperceptibly, nudging him toward the center of the sector, while the container floated beside him in a containment field. Above the platform hung recorders, tubes, light tags, and thin recording membranes. Sam used to think that alien bureaucracy could be boring. Now he saw it turning into a hunt. There were 3 of them, the elite. He didn't realize it by their clothes. Many here didn't wear clothes in the human sense, but by the way the space around them was cleared. Their tanks had no visible gauges. Their tubes were connected directly to the station line, and the recorders at their throat plates looked more complex than those of the inspector. These beings didn't buy leaders. They distributed the right to buy leaders to others. The first elite tilted a long recorder toward the container. Bioactive base with a confirmed scent tag. Sector 17 has no independent right of reception. The cargo is subject to mandatory buyout in favor of the station. The crowd didn't make a sound, but Sam felt something shift within it. Somewhere behind him, Envis stopped breathing audibly, as if even the hum of his tank might interfere. "It's not a bioactive base," Sam said. "It's soil." The elite's recorder blinked. "The human party acknowledges the material status of the cargo. Mandatory buyout is permissible." Sam fell silent. Too late, but still. His attempt to simplify the situation had already become a record. The first elite continued. "The station offers compensation at the rate of a disputed substrate. The carrier's rights are preserved. The scent tag is transferred to the archive, pending clarification of the legal recipient." Sam understood the trick. Not entirely, but enough. They weren't going to destroy the cargo. They wanted to buy it as a commodity before the request officially became a request. If the soil is recognized as a substrate, it can be appraised. If appraised, bought out. If bought out, locked in the archive. And silence can once again be called stability. He looked at Envis. The old merchant didn't plead or offer hints. He just stood among the alien bodies, almost merging with the market, waiting to see if the human, chosen for his habit of not asking questions, would understand. "The soil promises not to bite if it isn't dragged to where its mouth will be gagged," Sam said. He said it like a crude joke, the way he spoke in cargo bays when he needed to break the tension. But by the last word, he knew he had made a mistake. The recorders above the platform flared green. Not just one, all of them at once. The crowd recoiled without a sound. Envis snapped his head up. The first elite froze, then turned the recorder toward Sam. Intonational structure matches the archival protection formula. 17th protocol, 3rd cycle. Refusal to transfer a weak resource to the control of a mandatory buyer. The oath is recorded. "What oath?" Sam felt the blood rush to his temples. "I said a phrase, a joke." "Here, a joke does not free the sound from its form," Envis said quietly. The second elite leaned forward. His recorder worked without delay, too smooth, almost alive. "Clarification of the oath's recipient is required. Pending clarification, the protected resource may be transferred to the temporary control of the station." "No," Sam said, carefully now, every word distinct. "I didn't give an oath to the station. I didn't give it to you. And I didn't transfer the cargo to your control." "Recipient not established," the first elite replied. "The system permits bidding for the right of interpretation." Now Sam understood completely. His words had become a commodity faster than he could regret them. The station heard an old protection formula in a human joke. But the elite weren't trying to buy the soil. They were trying to buy the recipient of the oath. If they were the first to force the protocol to recognize the station as the recipient, Sector 17's request would vanish into the archive again, and Sam would be left as the idiot who helped process the deal. Envis took a step closer to the platform, and his tank hummed at its limit. The formula originated alongside the scent tag of Sector 17. "A mediator without the right to vote cannot determine the recipient," the second elite said. "His testimony is paid for by private air and carries no regulatory weight." Sam turned toward him sharply. "He spoke to me before the bidding. A private conversation outside the trading record. Yet you hear my jokes perfectly well." The recorders flashed yellow. Sam bit his tongue. One more phrase, and they would find a way to use it against him. The first elite raised a limb. A wide circle of light switched on above the platform, and the container was lifted slightly higher, like an item in a display window. Bidding is open. Object: the right to interpret the protective formula uttered by the human party. Temporary resource: a container with a scent tag. Parties are admitted by confirmed air right. Sam heard a death sentence in that phrase. Sector 17 did not have a confirmed air right. This meant they would not be admitted to the bidding for their own request. He looked at the soil in the container, at the mark near the bottom, almost hidden by shadow, at Envis, who was wasting air just to stand nearby. And for the first time in many years, Sam could not hide behind a manifest. He was no longer just a carrier. His voice had already been used as a tool, and now silence meant not caution, but consent. "Then I am clarifying the destination," he said. The recorders froze. The first elite slowly turned its neck plate. The human party does not possess the right of interpretation after the bidding has opened. But it does possess the right to explain its own phrase. Sam spoke steadily, not loudly, trying to ensure his voice held neither threat, nor plea, nor joke. But in this place, even steadiness could become a trap. "I said that regarding the soil you want to buy. Regarding the soil with the tag of Sector 17. Regarding those who cannot come out here and name themselves, because your law turns their name into a violation." The yellow light above the platform flickered. The system did not accept the words, but it did not reject them either. The second elite intervened quickly. Unauthorized interpretation after the opening of bidding carries no weight without an act of transfer. Envis turned almost imperceptibly towards Sam. This was it, not words, an action. The floor beneath the platform shuddered again. The bidding was moving into a procedure where Sam had no stake, no right, and no language. He needed to do something before the elite could mold his phrase into their own form. The third elite, who had been silent until now, signaled the security. Parties to the waiting lock. Pressure per dispute protocol. Until the recipient is established, the resource remains on the platform. Sam wanted to object, but Envis gave an almost invisible shake of his limb. Not now. Not with words. They were led toward a side airlock. Sam, Envis, and one security official with a regulatory tank that had no meter. The container followed in a containment field. The crowd parted in silence. No one looked openly, but Sam felt their attention on his skin. Somewhere out there, among those who had no right to utter the name of their sector, his accidental joke had already become a hope that someone else's hands might buy. The airlock door closed with a soft sucking sound. The air vanished from the gap faster than the mechanism could seal. Sam grabbed the wall because the floor tilted immediately, and the ceiling turned out to be even lower than in the holding cell. The security official stood by the panel. Envis pressed against the opposite wall, and the container hovered between them, open by a thin crack. "Now they'll wait for the pressure to make us more cooperative?" Sam asked. "They will wait until you speak incorrectly again," Envis replied. The airlock was more cramped than the cell because here, the tightness was already part of the procedure. The ceiling pressed down on his shoulders, the floor sloped at a slight angle, and the walls were smooth and awkward for a human hand to grip. The security officer stood by the control panel, not looking at Sam, and his regulatory tank hummed steadily, without a meter, connected to the station line as a sign of privilege. Envis stayed by the opposite wall, pressing his limbs close to his body. His own tank hummed quieter than usual, and Sam realized the old merchant was economizing not out of habit, but because his supply was reaching its limit. The container hung between them in a stasis field, the lid cracked open by a finger's width, and the scent of soil remained in the airlock, like an invisible witness that no one could expel from the protocol. The pressure did not begin to drop immediately. First, Sam felt a dryness in his throat, then a slight numbness in his fingers, and then he noticed how the security officer at the panel made a redundant movement and missed the sensor with his limb. It was strange. His tank should not have been dependent on the standby mode. A few seconds later, the regulator on the officer's chest jerked. The membrane at the throat plate began to work unevenly, and he slowly slumped against the wall, not falling, but as if losing his shape. The station was lowering the pressure according to the dispute protocol, and even its own employee found himself subject to the same economy, only realizing it later than the others. Sam stepped toward him before he could even think. In the reactor bay, in the cargo airlock, in the hold after depressurization, if someone starts to suffocate, you pull them toward a mask, a tank, any supply, before it's too late. He grabbed the officer by the shoulder ridge and reached for the emergency regulator on his chest with his other hand. The sensors flashed red. The panel by the door spat out a dry line. Physical contact with a service employee, aggression in a closed, disputed volume. The air vanished faster. Sam felt it on his skin. Fatigue descended from above like a heavy blanket, and his fingers immediately became harder to command. "I'm helping him," he said, already knowing the phrase was useless. Assistance without authorization is classified as pressure on a service representative, the panel replied. Sam cursed under his breath and let go of the officer. The man slid further down the wall, but continued to breathe, albeit in fits and starts. The system didn't kill its own. It simply sedated everything that interfered with the procedure. There was something worse than cruelty in this. The calm confidence of a mechanism that never considers itself at fault because it acts according to the rules. Envis moved not toward the officer, but toward the container. Sam initially wanted to bark at him, then saw the gesture and went quiet. The old merchant touched the soil, then his breathing tube, then the soil again. The meaning didn't register immediately. The scent. Not a word, not a right, not a bid. The scent was the only thing Sector 17 could still send through the hands of others. But the scent of soil alone wasn't enough. The elite had already nearly turned it into a commodity, an archival object, a disputed substrate. They needed an address established by action, not by explanation. Sam pulled out his flask. There wasn't much water left, the very same water he used to heat food in the cell. He unscrewed the cap, and the scent of moisture immediately mingled with the dry soil. The sensors blinked orange, but not red. The system did not understand where the assault was, where the transfer was, or where the tampering with evidence began. Sam knelt down, pressing his shoulder against the low ceiling, and emptied some of the soil onto the floor panel. In the cramped space, he had to work almost blindly, elbows tucked against his ribs, wrists twisted, breath coming in short gasps. He made a hollow in the earth, poured in the water, stirred it with his fingers, then took the remains of a food bar and crumbled it in as well. The result was a muddy slurry, smelling of soil, human food, and water from his flask. The security official stopped reaching for the panel. Envis looked at the mud, as if Sam hadn't stained the floor, but had opened an ancient door. Sam held out a palm full of wet earth to him, not to the elite, not to the station, not to the recorder, to Envis, the one who had come to the container, as if to a grave, and called Sector 17 a memory, not just a number. The old merchant hesitated for only a second, then touched the mud, raised his limb to his breathing tube, and wiped it across the membrane. The tank shuddered. The scent entered his respiratory system, mixed now not only with soil, but with human water, human food, and a human act, performed without a bid and without a price. The panel flashed a color Sam had never seen before. Not red, not green, not yellow, but a dull white, like the emergency lights on old ships. The recorder took a long time to produce a line. Finally, an entry appeared on the panel. Act of resource transfer. Recipient identified via intermediary with verified scent memory. Bidding suspended. The pressure stopped dropping. Sam didn't realize it immediately because his lungs were still working in a panic, but after a few breaths it became clear. The air was no longer bleeding out. The security official by the wall began to breathe more evenly. Envis lowered his limb from the tube, and there was no submission in his silence. There was a recognition there that needed no translator. Did it work? Sam asked. Envis looked at the panel, then at the mud in Sam's palm. They didn't have time to buy your words. You tied them to an action. I just made some mud. On this station, names have been taken for less. The airlock door didn't open immediately. For several minutes they stood in the cramped space, smelling of earth, salt, sweat, and old metal. Sam kept his stained palm on his knee, feeling the soil from the greenhouse, which only that morning he had considered a pointless cargo, stuck under his fingernails. Merrick surfaced in his mind again, but this time not as an accusation, but as a question that had long been waiting for an answer. Back then, Sam had remained silent and called it professionalism. Now, he still didn't understand everything, but for the first time, he didn't hide behind ignorance. When the door finally slid aside, it wasn't the inspectors from the checkpoint standing there, but the station archivist. Sam recognized him by his recorder, long, with additional membranes and physical seal tape, connected directly to the network. Such beings do not argue in the corridor. They arrive when the argument has already become a record. Beyond the archivist, the trading sector was visible, but the crowd stayed further back than before. Sam noticed that many of the tanks were no longer humming in their usual steady rhythm. The station knew how to be afraid, too. It just did so through the breath of others. "Recording complete," the archivist stated. His voice came from the recorder panel, but it carried the weariness of a living being. "The container with the scent tag of Sector 17 is transferred to the control of Envis's faction as a verified intermediary. The human party forfeits ownership of the cargo. In exchange, the right to trade, the right of passage, and the right to leave the station without extended penalties are maintained." Sam smirked out of the corner of his mouth. The recorder blinked, but the archivist chose not to escalate that tone into a new dispute. Sam looked at Envis. The old merchant stood very still. His tank was no longer humming at its limit, but there was more tension in that calm sound than in his previous haste. Quote, _105 Sam asked. The archivist delayed the response, as if choosing a phrasing that wouldn't shatter the station's facade. Quote 106, quote 107, quote 108, quote 109, Envis said. Sam wanted to reply that it sounded like a mockery, but he looked at the market and said nothing. For a station where silence was made law, even such a phrasing could be a victory. Tiny, ugly, and framed so that the elite wouldn't lose their dignity. Off to the side of the platform, he saw several beings without elite tanks. They didn't approach, didn't wave limbs, didn't shout. They simply stood near one another, and their breathing membranes moved a little more freely than before. The archivist held out a physical seal tape. Quote 110 _. Sam took the tape. The text was short and slippery, like all documents written by victors who refused to admit defeat. He was forfeiting the cargo, waiving all claims, and confirming that the act of transfer was voluntary, while the station retained the right to describe the event in its own register. Any lawyer on the central routes would have told him not to sign without an appeal. Any captain who needed to get out of here alive would have signed immediately. Sam pressed his wristband to the tape, and the alien ink darkened at the mark's location. The container was wheeled away without him. 4 mechanical grippers lifted it from the containment field and guided it deep into the sector, no longer toward the elite archives, but toward a side passage, where Envis stood. Sam noticed that the soil at the bottom no longer looked like mere cargo. There, beneath the lid, was a scent, a sign, and now a part of his own action, which the station was forced to interpret in a way that didn't favor those who were used to buying meanings in advance. Quote 111 Envis said once the archivist had left. Quote 112, quote 113, quote 114. Sam looked at him. He wanted to snap back but couldn't find the strength. "Yeah, now you asked. A bit late." Envis touched the container as it slowly receded into the passage. "For the dead, yes. For those who still breathe, sometimes it is enough." They walked out to the docks together, though formally Sam was now free to go alone. The ceiling there was higher, and his body didn't believe it right away. His shoulders remained hunched, his back kept the curve of the low cells, and his breath still tried to conserve air that was no longer being taken away. The cargo ramp of his tug was lowered, the hatch open. Inside the compartment, the bare floor was visible, covered in dust from the container, and an old streak of grease by the wall. Ordinary dirt from an ordinary run. After everything that had happened, it looked almost familiar. A small packet lay by Envis's counter. Sam noticed it from the ramp. The packet was unaccounted for, without a recorder, without a seal, without a price. Inside, a handful of soil darkened, mixed with dried bar crumbs and traces of water, the remains of what the system couldn't immediately label as merchandise. Envis didn't explain who it was for. Sam didn't ask. Some things, as he was beginning to understand, shouldn't be dragged into the light prematurely, just because you got curious, Envis said. The old merchant once again made that intermittent sound, like a valve coughing. Laughter, now a little freer. Quote 121 Sam stepped onto the ramp and stopped at the hatch. He could have said something appropriate, an apology, a promise, a beautiful phrase about how everything would change now. But beautiful phrases on this station became someone else's property all too easily. So he only nodded to Envis and entered the ship. The cargo hold smelled of metal, old grease, and soil. The container was gone, but dust remained in the corners and on the floor, like a reminder that didn't make it onto the invoice. Sam placed the pot on the small stove by the technical panel, poured in the remaining water, and turned on the heat. Steam rose to the ceiling, hit the cold metal, and settled as droplets. The spoon clinked softly against the rim. No one flashed red, no one demanded a classification, no one offered a tariff for the noise. He was preparing food alone, in an empty ship, before a run that would no longer turn a profit. The log would show a delay, cargo loss, a strange port act, and perhaps a warning for future visits to Veir-Silence. In someone else's registry, something else would remain. A human gesture that the elite didn't manage to buy, and the address of a faction that had to be recognized once more, at least enough to let it breathe without a middleman. Victory looked like a loss. Sam wasn't even sure he had the right to call it a victory, but when the water boiled, he didn't turn off the stove. He listened to the small noise of the pot, and for the first time in many years, was in no hurry to silence everything that kept the flight from staying on schedule.